The old clock on the wall showed 6 in the evening when Maria Gonzalez pushed her cleaning cart through the back door of the Hartwell Conservatory of Music. And just like every other day for the past 15 years, nobody turned to look at her, nobody said hello, and nobody even noticed that she had arrived. She was 68 years old now, with gray hair that she always pulled back into a simple bun, and her hands were rough and dry from years of working with soap and water and cleaning chemicals that made her skin crack during the cold winter months. But she never complained because this job paid her bills and put food on her table. And that was all that mattered to a woman like her who had learned long ago that life does not always give you what you dream of. The conservatory was a grand and beautiful building, with tall marble columns at the entrance and long hallways that seemed to stretch on forever. And the floors were made of polished wood that Maria had to mop every single night until they shined like mirrors. And the walls were decorated with paintings of famous musicians and composers whose names the students knew by heart, but whose faces meant nothing to a cleaning lady who was just trying to get through another shift. Every evening, Maria would start her work on the 3rd floor where the practice rooms were located, and she could hear the young students inside those rooms playing their instruments, some of them playing the violin with such skill that it made her heart ache, others banging on the piano keys with frustration because they could not get a difficult piece right, and she would push her cart past those doors and listen to all of it, soaking in every note like a plant soaking in sunlight after a long dark winter. The students at Hartwell came from wealthy families, and they wore expensive clothes and carried instruments that cost more money than Maria would earn in 10 years of cleaning. And when they walked past her in the hallways, they looked right through her as if she was made of glass, as if she was not even there, as if she was just another piece of furniture like the benches and the trash cans and the old radiators that lined the walls. She had grown used to being invisible over the years, and sometimes she wondered if this was what ghosts felt like, walking among the living but never being seen or heard or acknowledged. And she would shake her head and tell herself to stop being so dramatic because she was just a cleaning lady and cleaning ladies were not supposed to be noticed. They were supposed to do their work quietly and stay out of the way and never cause any trouble. There was one student in particular who made Maria feel the smallest, and his name was David Chen, a tall young man with dark hair and confident eyes who was in his final year at the conservatory. And everyone said he was the most talented piano student the school had seen in decades, and he walked through the hallways like he owned the building, always surrounded by friends who laughed at his jokes and admired his talent. One evening, Maria was mopping the floor near the main staircase when David and his group of friends came walking down, talking loudly about a competition that David was going to enter, and Maria quickly moved her mop and bucket to the side to let them pass. But as she did, some of the dirty water splashed onto David's expensive leather shoes. He stopped and looked down at his feet, and then he looked up at Maria with such coldness in his eyes that she felt her stomach drop, and his friends went quiet as they waited to see what he would do. And Maria opened her mouth to apologize, but before she could speak, David just shook his head and walked away, muttering something under his breath that she could not hear but could easily imagine. That night, Maria finished her work feeling more tired than usual, not in her body but in her soul, because there is a kind of tiredness that comes from being treated like you are worth nothing, like your existence is an inconvenience to people who think they are better than you just because they have money and talent and youth on their side. She thought about her daughter Rosa, who worked as a nurse at the city hospital, and who always told her mother that she should retire and come live with her. And Maria always said no, because she was not ready to stop working yet, because working gave her a reason to wake up in the morning. But on nights like this, she wondered if maybe Rosa was right. The conservatory had a total of 4 floors, and after Maria finished the 3rd floor, she would move down to the 2nd where the classrooms were located, and then to the 1st floor where the offices and the library could be found, and finally she would end her night in the basement where the storage rooms and the old archives gathered dust in the darkness. But there was one room that Maria always saved for last, and it was not in the basement but on the first floor, at the very end of the east hallway, and it was the most beautiful room in the entire building, a room that made her heart beat faster every time she stepped inside, a room that held something so precious to her that she could not put it into words. It was the Grand Recital Hall, a magnificent space with high ceilings and velvet curtains and rows upon rows of red seats that could hold 500 people. And at the center of the stage stood the most beautiful thing Maria had ever seen in her life, a Steinway grand piano that was as black as midnight and as shiny as a still lake under the moonlight. Famous musicians from all over the world had played on that piano, and students would practice on it before their important performances, and Maria had spent 15 years cleaning around it, dusting the stage, vacuuming the carpet, polishing the wooden railings, but she had never once touched the piano itself because that was not her place. That was not who she was anymore. She would stand at the edge of the stage and look at the piano from a distance, and sometimes her fingers would twitch at her sides as if they remembered something that her mind had tried so hard to forget, and she would close her eyes and take a deep breath and remind herself that some doors, once closed, can never be opened again, no matter how much you wish they could be. And so Maria Gonzalez continued to be the invisible woman of Hartwell Conservatory, pushing her cart through the hallways night after night, year after year, carrying a secret inside her heart that was so heavy it sometimes felt like it would crush her, a secret that nobody knew and nobody would ever discover, or so she believed with all her tired and lonely soul. Every night, after all the floors had been mopped and all the trash cans had been emptied and all the classrooms had been cleaned until they sparkled, Maria Gonzalez would do something that nobody else in the world knew about, something that had become as important to her as breathing, something that she had done every single night for 15 years without ever telling a living soul. She would wait in the shadows of the first-floor hallway, standing perfectly still near the janitor's closet where she kept her supplies, and she would listen to the sounds of the building growing quiet around her, the last footsteps of late-working professors fading away, the last doors closing with soft clicks, the last lights being switched off one by one until the conservatory fell into darkness and silence. Only then, when she was absolutely certain that she was alone, would Maria begin to walk toward the Grand Recital Hall at the end of the east hallway, and her footsteps would echo in the empty corridor like a heartbeat, slow and steady, and full of anticipation, and her hands would tremble slightly at her sides as they always did when she made this journey. The door to the recital hall was always unlocked because Maria was the one responsible for locking it at the end of her shift, and she would push it open slowly, carefully, as if she was entering a sacred place like a church or a temple. And in many ways that is exactly what this room was to her, a holy place where something magical had once lived and still waited in the shadows. The hall was dark except for the small emergency lights that glowed red near the exits, and Maria would stand at the back of the room for a long moment, letting her eyes adjust to the darkness, and then she would begin to walk down the center aisle between the rows of empty velvet seats, her heart beating faster with every step she took. The stage rose up at the front of the hall like an altar, and Maria would climb the 3 small steps that led up to it, and her shoes would make soft sounds on the polished wood, and she would stop a few feet away from the grand piano that sat in the center of the stage, its black surface gleaming even in the near darkness. She never turned on the stage lights because she was afraid that someone might see them from outside the building, and she never made any noise because she was afraid that a security guard might hear her. And so she would simply stand there in the darkness and look at the piano, her eyes drinking in every curve and line of its beautiful body. The Steinway was a 9-foot concert grand, the finest piano that money could buy, and it was worth more than Maria would earn in 50 years of cleaning, and it had ivory keys that were smooth and cool to the touch, though Maria did not know this from experience because she had never allowed herself to touch those keys, not even once in 15 years. She would stand there for 5 minutes, sometimes 10, sometimes even longer on the nights when her heart felt especially heavy. And she would remember things that she had tried so hard to forget, memories that came flooding back to her like water breaking through a dam, memories of music and applause and a life that seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Sometimes she would close her eyes and she could almost hear the piano playing, a beautiful melody that floated through the darkness like a ghost, and she could almost feel the keys beneath her fingers, smooth and familiar and waiting for her to bring them to life, and her whole body would ache with a longing so deep that it felt like physical pain. On those nights, Maria would have to force herself to step back from the piano, to turn around and walk away, to remind herself that she was just a cleaning lady now, and that the past was dead and gone, and there was no point in wishing for things that could never be. And she would leave the recital hall with tears in her eyes that she would wipe away before anyone could see. Her coworkers at the conservatory knew nothing about this secret ritual, and they probably would have laughed if they had found out. Because why would an old cleaning lady spend her nights staring at a piano she could not play? Why would she waste her time looking at an instrument that belonged to a world she was not part of? Why would she torture herself with memories of a life she could never have again? But Maria could not help herself, because the piano called to her in a voice that only she could hear, a voice that whispered her name in the darkness and begged her to come closer, a voice that reminded her of who she used to be before life took everything away from her and left her with nothing but a mop and a bucket and a blue uniform that made her invisible to the world. There was a photograph that Maria kept hidden in her wallet, a small black and white picture that was worn and faded from years of being touched and looked at, and it showed a young girl of about 16 sitting at a piano on a grand stage, her fingers on the keys, her eyes closed in concentration, her whole body alive with the music she was creating. That girl was Maria, though she looked so different now that nobody would ever believe it. And in the photograph she was wearing a beautiful white dress, and her hair was long and dark and flowing over her shoulders, and she was performing at the National Music Competition in Havana, Cuba, the most important night of her young life. She had won first place that night, and the crowd had given her a standing ovation that lasted for 5 whole minutes, and the judges had said that she was the most gifted young pianist they had ever heard. And everyone said that she would go on to become famous, that she would play in concert halls all over the world, that nothing could stop her from achieving greatness. But life, Maria had learned, does not care about what everyone says, and life does not care about talent or dreams or standing ovations. And life had taken that 16-year-old girl and her beautiful white dress and her promising future, and thrown them all away like trash. And now here she was, 52 years later, standing in the darkness of a recital hall in a country that was not her own, looking at a piano she was too afraid to touch. Every night, Maria made herself a promise that tomorrow would be different, that tomorrow she would finally work up the courage to sit down at that piano and place her fingers on the keys and play just one note, just to see if she could still do it, just to see if the music was still inside her after all these years of silence. But every night, she broke that promise to herself, because the fear was too strong and the memories were too painful, and the distance between who she was and who she had been felt like an ocean that she could never cross. And so, she would lock the recital hall door behind her and walk out into the cold night air and tell herself that maybe tomorrow would finally be the day. Maria Elena Gonzalez was born on a warm spring morning in the year 1957 in a small yellow house on a quiet street in Havana, Cuba. And from the moment she came into this world, her father knew that she was going to be special, that there was something different about this tiny baby with the dark eyes and the curious fingers that were always reaching out to touch everything around her. Her father, Roberto Gonzalez, was a piano teacher who gave lessons to the children of wealthy families in the city, and their small house was filled with music from morning until night, with the sound of scales and etudes and sonatas floating through the open windows and out into the street where neighbors would stop to listen and smile. When Maria was only 3 years old, she climbed up onto the piano bench while her father was teaching a lesson in the other room, and when he came back, he found her pressing the keys with her tiny fingers, not randomly like most children would do, but slowly and deliberately, as if she was trying to figure out how the instrument worked, as if she was having a conversation with it in a language that only they understood. Roberto was amazed by what he saw, and from that day forward, he began to teach his daughter everything he knew about music. And Maria learned faster than any student he had ever had, absorbing information like a sponge absorbs water, her small fingers growing stronger and more confident with each passing day. By the time she was 5 years old, Maria could play simple pieces by Mozart and Beethoven, and by the time she was 7, she was performing at local concerts and recitals, and people would come from all over Havana just to hear this child prodigy, this little girl with the magical fingers who could make the piano sing like a human voice. Her mother, Elena, was a quiet woman who worked as a seamstress to help support the family, and she would sit in the audience at every one of Maria's performances, her eyes filled with tears of pride, her hands clapping so hard they would turn red, her heart bursting with love for this daughter who had been blessed with such an incredible gift. The years passed quickly, and Maria grew from a child into a young woman, and her talent only became greater with each passing year. And by the time she was 16, she was the most famous young pianist in all of Cuba, and everyone said that she would one day be known all over the world, that she would bring honor and glory to her country with her extraordinary music. In the summer of 1973, Maria entered the National Music Competition, the most important competition for young musicians in Cuba, and she practiced for months before the big night, playing the same piece over and over again until her fingers knew every note by heart, until the music became as natural to her as breathing. The piece she chose was Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, a beautiful and difficult composition that many adult pianists struggled to play well. But Maria had fallen in love with this piece the first time she heard it, and she knew that it was the perfect way to show the world what she could do. On the night of the competition, Maria walked onto the stage in a beautiful white dress that her mother had made for her, and she sat down at the grand piano and closed her eyes, and for a moment the entire concert hall went silent, 500 people holding their breath, waiting to hear what this young girl would do. And then Maria began to play, and the music that came from her fingers was so beautiful, so emotional, so full of life and passion and longing, that people in the audience began to cry. And when she finished, there was a moment of complete silence before the crowd erupted in the loudest applause Maria had ever heard. She won first place that night, and the judges gave her the highest score in the history of the competition, and everyone said that Maria Gonzalez was destined for greatness, that nothing could stop her now, that the whole world would soon know her name. But the world is a cruel place, and just 2 years after that glorious night, everything Maria had worked for, everything she loved, everything she dreamed of was taken away from her in the space of a single terrifying week. It was 1975, and the political situation in Cuba had become dangerous for people like the Gonzalez family, people who had spoken too freely about their beliefs, people who had friends in places that the government did not approve of. And one night, Roberto came home with fear in his eyes and told his family that they had to leave the country immediately. There was no time to pack their belongings, no time to say goodbye to friends and neighbors, no time to do anything except grab a few clothes and some money and run to the harbor, where a small fishing boat was waiting to take them away from the only home they had ever known. Maria begged her father to let her bring her music books, her competition medals, anything that would remind her of the life she was leaving behind. But Roberto shook his head and said there was no room, that they had to travel light, that their lives were more important than any possession, and Maria cried the entire way to the harbor. The journey across the ocean was terrifying, with waves crashing against the small boat and Maria holding onto her mother so tightly that her arms ached. And when they finally reached the shores of Florida 3 days later, they had nothing except the clothes on their backs and a few dollars in Roberto's pocket. They settled in a small apartment in Miami, and Roberto tried to find work as a piano teacher. But his English was not good, and people did not trust this strange man from Cuba. And eventually, he had to take a job washing dishes at a restaurant just to put food on the table. Maria watched her father come home every night with his hands raw and red from the hot water, and she saw the shame in his eyes, the defeat in his shoulders, and she knew that their dreams of music and fame were over, that survival was all that mattered now, that the life they had known in Cuba was gone forever. She tried to find a piano to practice on, but pianos cost money and they had no money, and the years passed by one after another, and Maria got a job cleaning houses to help support her family. And then she met a man named Carlos and they got married and had a daughter named Rosa, and life went on the way life does, one day at a time, 1 year at a time. Her father died when Maria was 40 years old, and on his deathbed, he held her hand and told her that he was sorry that he could not give her the life she deserved, sorry that he had taken her away from her destiny. And Maria told him that she forgave him, that she loved him, that he was the best father anyone could ask for. But late at night, when Carlos was asleep and the house was quiet, Maria would sometimes lie awake and think about the girl in the white dress, the girl who had played Chopin for 500 people, the girl who was supposed to become famous, and she would wonder what had happened to that girl, where she had gone, if she was still alive somewhere inside this tired old woman with the rough hands and the broken dreams. And now here she was, 68 years old, working as a cleaning lady at a music conservatory, surrounded by young people who had the chance to live the life that should have been hers. And every night she would stand in the darkness of the recital hall and look at the piano that she was too afraid to touch. And she would remember everything she had lost, everything she had given up, everything she could never get back. It was the 15th of November, and the weather outside was bitter cold, with a harsh wind that cut through the streets like a knife and made Maria pull her thin coat tighter around her body as she walked from the bus stop to the conservatory, her breath coming out in white clouds that disappeared into the dark winter air. She had been feeling strange all day, filled with a restless energy that she could not explain, as if something important was about to happen, as if the universe was trying to tell her something that she could not quite understand, and she had made mistakes during her cleaning shift, forgetting to empty trash cans and leaving streaks on the windows that she had to go back and fix. Her supervisor, a young man named Kevin who was half her age, had noticed that she was distracted and asked her if she was feeling okay, and Maria had smiled and said yes. She was fine, just a little tired, but the truth was that she had no idea what was wrong with her, no idea why her hands were shaking and her heart was beating so fast. That evening, as she pushed her cart through the hallways of the conservatory, she could hear a piano playing somewhere on the second floor, a student practicing a piece that Maria recognized immediately as Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece she had played at the national competition in Cuba all those years ago. She stopped in the middle of the hallway and closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her like a wave. And suddenly she was 16 years old again, sitting on the stage in her white dress, her fingers dancing across the keys, the audience holding their breath as they listened to the beautiful sound she was creating. The memory was so vivid, so real, that Maria had to reach out and grab the wall to keep herself from falling, and when she opened her eyes, there were tears streaming down her face, and her whole body was trembling as if she had a fever, and she knew that something had changed inside her. Something had finally broken loose after 52 years of being locked away. She finished her work as quickly as she could, racing through the rooms without her usual careful attention to detail. And when she finally reached the recital hall at the end of her shift, she was breathing hard and her heart was pounding so loud that she could hear it in her ears. The hall was dark and empty, just like it always was at this time of night, and Maria walked down the center aisle toward the stage. But this time her steps were different, faster and more determined, as if she was no longer in control of her own body, as if something else was moving her forward. She climbed the steps to the stage and stood in front of the grand piano, and for a long moment she just looked at it, this beautiful instrument that had haunted her dreams for 15 years, this symbol of everything she had lost and everything she had been too afraid to reclaim. And then, before she could stop herself, before she could talk herself out of it like she had done 1,000 times before, Maria sat down on the piano bench. Her heart was beating so fast that she thought it might explode, and her hands were shaking so badly that she had to press them flat against her thighs to steady them. And she took a deep breath and tried to calm herself down, telling herself that she did not have to play, that she could just sit here for a moment and then get up and leave, that nobody was forcing her to do anything. But then she looked down at the keyboard, at those beautiful black and white keys that she had not touched in over 40 years, and something inside her chest cracked open like an egg, and all the pain and longing and regret that she had been carrying for so long came pouring out. She lifted her hands from her thighs and placed them on the keys, and the moment her fingers touched the smooth ivory, she felt a jolt of electricity run through her body, a feeling so powerful and so familiar that she had to bite her lip to keep from crying out. The keys were cool and smooth beneath her fingers, just as she remembered, and her hands seemed to know exactly where to go, as if they had been waiting all these years for this moment, as if they had never forgotten even though Maria had tried so hard to make them forget. She pressed down on a single key, a middle C, and the note rang out through the empty hall, pure and clear and beautiful, and Maria felt something unlock inside her chest, something that had been closed for so long that she had forgotten it was even there. And then, without thinking, without planning, without even knowing what she was doing, Maria began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece she had performed at the national competition in Cuba, the same piece that had made 500 people cry, the same piece that had been the soundtrack to her greatest triumph and her greatest loss. At first, her fingers stumbled and made mistakes, hitting wrong notes and missing chords, and Maria felt a wave of despair wash over her, thinking that she had forgotten how to play, that the music was gone forever, that she was just a foolish old woman trying to relive a past that was dead and buried. But she did not stop. She kept playing, and slowly, note by note, measure by measure, her fingers began to remember what they had once known. The muscle memory coming back like a friend returning after a long journey, and the mistakes became fewer, and the music became stronger. By the time she reached the middle section of the piece, Maria was no longer thinking about what her fingers were doing. She was no longer worrying about wrong notes or missed chords. She was simply playing, letting the music flow through her like water through a river, letting it carry her away to a place she had not been in 52 years. Tears were streaming down her face, but she did not stop to wipe them away, and her body was swaying with the emotion of the music, just as it had done when she was a young girl on stage in Havana. And for the first time in decades, Maria felt truly alive, truly herself, truly whole. The music filled the empty recital hall, bouncing off the walls and the ceiling and the rows of velvet seats, and if anyone had been there to hear it, they would have been amazed by what they heard, by the beauty and the passion and the raw emotion that this old woman in a cleaning uniform was creating with her weathered, work-worn hands. She played for what felt like hours, losing herself completely in the music, forgetting about the conservatory and her cleaning cart and her supervisor Kevin, and all the students who had looked through her like she was invisible, forgetting about everything except the feel of the keys beneath her fingers and the sound of the notes rising up into the darkness. When she finally reached the last chord of the piece, Maria pressed the keys down and held them there, letting the sound fade slowly into silence. And then she lifted her hands from the keyboard and placed them in her lap. And she sat there on the piano bench with her eyes closed, breathing hard, feeling like she had just run a marathon. She had done it. She had finally done it. After 15 years of standing in the darkness and looking at this piano from a distance, she had finally found the courage to sit down and play, and the music was still inside her. It had never left. It had just been waiting for her to come back. Maria opened her eyes and looked at her hands, these old hands with their calluses and their cracks and their age spots, and she could hardly believe that they had just created something so beautiful, that they still had the power to make music after all these years of scrubbing floors and washing windows. She was so lost in her own thoughts that she did not notice the faces pressed against the glass doors at the back of the recital hall, the group of students who had been drawn by the sound of the music and who now stood there in shock, unable to believe what they had just witnessed, unable to understand how the old cleaning lady had just played one of the most difficult pieces in the piano repertoire with the skill of a master. David Chen had stayed late at the conservatory that night because he was preparing for the most important competition of his life, the International Young Pianists Championship that would take place in Vienna in just 3 months. And he knew that if he wanted to win, he would have to practice harder than he had ever practiced before. He was in one of the small practice rooms on the second floor, working on the same chop-in piece that he had been struggling with for weeks, trying to get the difficult middle section just right, when he heard something strange, a faint sound coming from somewhere downstairs, a sound that made him stop playing and tilt his head to listen. At first, he thought he was imagining things, because the sound was so quiet and distant that it could have been anything, but then it grew louder, and David realized that someone was playing the piano in the recital hall, and not just playing, but playing beautifully, playing with a skill and emotion that made his own practice session seem weak in comparison. He got up from the piano bench and walked out into the hallway, and there he found 4 of his friends who had also stayed late to practice, and they were all standing with confused looks on their faces, all of them having heard the same mysterious music floating up through the building. There was Sarah, a violinist with red hair and freckles who always laughed at David's jokes, and Michael, a cellist who came from a wealthy family in Boston and drove a car that cost more than most people's houses, and Jennifer, a pianist who was David's main rival at the conservatory, and who secretly hated him even though she pretended to be his friend, and Tom, a quiet young man who played the clarinet and rarely spoke, but who was always there whenever the group got together. "Who's playing down there?" Sarah asked, her eyes wide with curiosity, and David shook his head and said he had no idea, because all the professors had gone home hours ago, and the recital hall was supposed to be empty at this time of night. They decided to go downstairs together to investigate, walking quietly through the dark hallways like a group of explorers venturing into unknown territory, following the sound of the music that grew louder and more beautiful with every step they took. When they reached the recital hall, they stopped outside the glass doors and peered inside, and what they saw made them gasp in shock and confusion, because sitting at the grand piano on stage, illuminated only by the dim red glow of the emergency lights, was the old cleaning lady in her faded blue uniform. Michael was the first to laugh, a loud snort of disbelief that he quickly tried to cover with his hand, and then Jennifer started giggling, and soon Tom was chuckling too, because the sight was just so ridiculous, so impossible, so completely unexpected that they did not know how else to react. "Is this some kind of joke?" David whispered, pressing his face closer to the glass to get a better look, and he watched as Maria's rough, weathered hands moved across the keyboard, and he expected to hear clumsy, amateurish notes, expected to hear the kind of playing you might get from someone who had taken a few lessons as a child and never touched a piano again. But that was not what he heard, not even close, because the music that came through the glass doors was extraordinary, was magnificent, was the kind of playing that David had only ever heard from world-class performers at professional concerts, and his laughter died in his throat as he realized what he was witnessing. "Wait," Sarah said, grabbing David's arm, her face suddenly serious. "She's actually good, like really good, like better than any of us good." And the others fell silent as they listened, their smiles fading, their eyes growing wide with disbelief. The piece she was playing was Chopin's Ballade No. 1, the same piece David had been working on upstairs, but she played it in a way that David had never heard before, with a depth of emotion and a technical perfection that seemed almost impossible, especially coming from an old woman in a cleaning uniform. "How is this happening?" Michael whispered, and nobody had an answer because what they were seeing did not make any sense, did not fit into any category they understood, did not match anything they thought they knew about the world. Jennifer, who had always been the most critical and the most jealous of the group, was the first to recover from her shock, and she crossed her arms over her chest and said that the cleaning lady was probably just playing a recording through the speakers, that there was no way an old woman who mopped floors for a living could actually play like that. But David looked at Maria's hands, watched them move across the keys with a fluidity and grace that could not be faked, watched her body sway with the music in a way that showed she was feeling every note deep in her soul. And he knew that Jennifer was wrong. He knew that what they were witnessing was real. Tom, who rarely spoke, suddenly said something that made them all turn to look at him, and he said, "She's crying, look at her face, she's crying while she plays." And they all looked closer and saw that he was right, saw the tears streaming down Maria's weathered cheeks as her fingers danced across the ivory keys. There was something in those tears that made David's chest feel tight, something that spoke of loss and longing and decades of hidden pain, and he suddenly felt ashamed of himself for laughing, felt ashamed for all the times he had walked past this woman without seeing her, without acknowledging her existence. The music built to its climax, the notes crashing like waves against a rocky shore, and Maria's whole body seemed to be possessed by the spirit of the composition, leaning into the piano with an intensity that was almost frightening, her gray hair coming loose from its bun and falling around her face. And then, as the final chord rang out through the hall and faded slowly into silence, the 5 students stood frozen behind the glass doors. Unable to move, unable to speak, unable to process what they had just witnessed. Sarah was the first to break the silence, and her voice was barely a whisper when she said, "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard. Who is this woman? Where did she learn to play like that? Why is she working as a cleaning lady when she could be performing on stages all over the world?" David did not answer because he did not know, but he felt something stirring inside him, a curiosity that was more powerful than anything he had felt in a long time, and he knew that he had to find out the truth about this mysterious old woman who had just shattered everything he thought he knew. He pushed open the glass door slowly, carefully, trying not to make a sound, but the old hinges creaked loudly in the silence, and Maria's eyes flew open and she turned to look at the back of the hall, and when she saw the 5 students standing there, her face went pale with fear. She stood up from the piano bench so quickly that it scraped against the stage floor with a harsh sound, and she began to stammer out an apology, saying that she was sorry, that she knew she should not have touched the piano, that she would understand if they reported her and she got fired. But David held up his hand to stop her, and he walked slowly down the aisle between the rows of empty seats, his eyes never leaving her face, and when he reached the edge of the stage, he looked up at this small, frightened woman in her faded blue uniform, and he asked her the question that would change both their lives forever. "Who are you?" he said, his voice soft and full of wonder, and Maria looked down at him with tears still wet on her cheeks, and she opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out, because she had not been asked that question in so many years that she had almost forgotten the answer. The other students followed David down the aisle and gathered at the foot of the stage, all of them looking up at Maria with expressions of awe and curiosity and shame, all of them realizing that they had been walking past a treasure every single day without knowing it, all of them hungry to hear the story of this impossible woman who had just played the piano like an angel. Maria stood on the stage with her heart pounding in her chest, looking down at the 5 young students who were staring up at her with expressions she could not quite read, and she felt like a deer caught in the headlights of an oncoming car, frozen in place, unable to run, unable to hide, unable to do anything except wait for the disaster she knew was coming. She had been caught, after 15 years of being careful, after 15 years of waiting until the building was empty, after 15 years of keeping her secret locked away where nobody could find it. She had finally made a mistake, and now these students were going to report her, and she was going to lose her job, and everything she had worked so hard to build would come crashing down around her. Her mind raced through all the terrible possibilities, imagining herself being called into the supervisor's office, imagining the look of disappointment on Kevin's face as he told her she was fired, imagining having to explain to her daughter Rosa why she had been so foolish, why she had risked everything for a few minutes of playing a piano that did not belong to her. But then something strange happened, something Maria did not expect at all, because instead of anger or accusation in the eyes of the young man standing at the foot of the stage, she saw something else entirely, something that looked almost like respect, almost like admiration, almost like wonder. "Who are you?" he asked again, and his voice was gentle now, not mocking or cruel like she had expected, and Maria felt some of the fear drain out of her body, replaced by a confusion that was almost as overwhelming. She opened her mouth to answer, but the words got stuck in her throat, because how could she explain who she was? How could she summarize 68 years of life in a few simple sentences? How could she make these young people understand what it felt like to have everything taken away from you, and then spend decades watching others live the life that should have been yours? The red-haired girl, the one called Sarah, climbed up onto the stage and walked slowly toward Maria, and there were tears in her eyes, actual tears, and she reached out and took Maria's rough, weathered hand in her own soft, smooth one, and she said, "That was the most beautiful playing I have ever heard in my life. Please, you have to tell us your story." Maria looked down at their joined hands, at the contrast between her old skin and the young girl's fresh complexion, and she felt something crack open inside her chest, a wall that she had built around her heart so many years ago that she had forgotten it was even there. The other students climbed onto the stage too, gathering around Maria in a semicircle, and she could see that they were all affected by what they had witnessed, that her playing had touched something inside them that went beyond music, that went beyond technique, that went all the way down to the deepest part of their souls. Even the girl called Jennifer, who had been the most skeptical and the most dismissive, was looking at Maria with new eyes now, and there was shame on her face, shame for having laughed, shame for having doubted, shame for having judged this old woman based on nothing more than her uniform and her age. Maria took a deep breath and let it out slowly, feeling the tension leave her body, and she realized that she had a choice to make. She could either run away like she had been running for the past 52 years, or she could stay and finally tell her story to people who actually wanted to hear it. She looked at David, at this young man who had asked her the question that nobody had bothered to ask in decades, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of herself when she was young, that same hunger for music, that same passion for excellence, that same burning desire to be the best. "My name is Maria Elena Gonzalez," she said, and her voice was shaky at first but grew stronger with each word. "And I was born in Havana, Cuba, in 1957, and when I was 16 years old, I won the national music competition with the same piece you just heard me play." The students looked at each other in amazement, and David shook his head slowly as if he could not believe what he was hearing, and he said, "You won a national competition. You were a professional pianist. How did you end up here? How did you end up cleaning floors at a conservatory?" And so Maria began to tell her story, starting from the beginning. From the day her father first discovered her playing the piano at age 3, and the words came pouring out of her like water from a broken dam. All the memories she had kept locked away for so long finally finding their way into the light. She told them about her father Roberto and how he taught her everything she knew, about her mother Elena, who made her beautiful white dress for the competition, about the years of practice and sacrifice and dedication that had turned her into a prodigy. She told them about the night of the competition, about walking onto that stage in Havana with 500 people watching, about the standing ovation that lasted for 5 minutes, about the judges who said she was the most gifted young pianist they had ever heard. And then she told them about the night everything changed, about her father coming home with fear in his eyes, about the small fishing boat that carried them across the ocean to Florida, about the years of struggle and poverty that followed as they tried to build a new life in a country that did not want them. Sarah was crying openly now, the tears streaming down her freckled cheeks, and even Michael and Tom had wet eyes, and Jennifer had turned away because she did not want the others to see how affected she was by this old woman's story. David listened to every word with an intensity that surprised even himself, and as Maria spoke, he felt something shifting inside him, something fundamental changing in the way he saw the world and his place in it. He had always taken his talent for granted, had always assumed that success would come to him because he was special, because he was gifted, because he had been born into a wealthy family that could afford the best teachers and the best instruments and the best opportunities. But here was this woman who had been just as talented, maybe even more talented, and life had taken everything away from her through no fault of her own, and she had spent 40 years scrubbing floors while people like David walked past her without even knowing she existed. When Maria finished her story, there was a long silence in the recital hall, and nobody knew what to say. Because what words could possibly be adequate in the face of such loss, such tragedy, such incredible resilience? Finally, David stepped forward and looked up at Maria with tears in his own eyes, and he said something that made her heart stop, something she never expected to hear from this young man who had once looked at her with such coldness and contempt. "I am so sorry," he said, and his voice was choked with emotion. "I am sorry for every time I walked past you without seeing you, for every time I treated you like you were invisible, for every time I thought I was better than you just because of where I came from. Can you ever forgive me?" And Maria looked at this young man, this talented pianist who reminded her so much of herself at that age, and she felt all the bitterness and resentment she had carried for so long begin to melt away, replaced by something warmer, something softer, something that felt almost like hope. The next morning, Maria woke up in her small apartment feeling like a different person, like something fundamental had shifted inside her during the night, like the weight she had been carrying on her shoulders for 52 years had suddenly become lighter. She lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling and thinking about what had happened in the recital hall, about the students who had gathered around her, about the tears in their eyes as she told her story, about the apology that David had offered with such sincerity and such shame. Part of her wondered if it had all been a dream, if she had imagined the whole thing, if her lonely mind had finally cracked and started creating fantasies to fill the emptiness of her life. But then she looked at her hands and remembered the feel of the piano keys beneath her fingers, and she knew that it had been real, every single moment of it. She got out of bed and made herself a cup of coffee, and she sat at her small kitchen table and watched the sun rise over the city, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange and gold. And she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something that took her a moment to recognize because it had been so long since she had experienced it. It was hope, that fragile and beautiful feeling that had abandoned her on the night she fled Cuba, that had stayed away through all the years of struggle and sacrifice, that had seemed lost forever as she pushed her cleaning cart through the hallways of the conservatory night after night. But now it was back, tiny and tentative like a flower pushing through concrete, and Maria did not know what to do with it, did not know if she should nurture it or crush it before it could grow any bigger and set her up for disappointment. Her phone rang, and she jumped in surprise because nobody ever called her this early in the morning except her daughter Rosa, and when she looked at the screen, she saw an unfamiliar number that made her heart beat faster with a mixture of fear and anticipation. She answered the call and heard a young voice on the other end, a voice she recognized from the night before, and David Chen introduced himself and apologized for calling so early. But he said he had been up all night thinking about what had happened and he needed to talk to her. Maria listened in silence as David explained that he had done some research after leaving the conservatory, that he had searched online for information about the national music competition in Cuba in 1973, and that he had found something that made him even more amazed than he already was. "I found a recording," he said, his voice trembling with excitement. "A recording of your performance at the competition. Someone had uploaded it to the internet years ago, and I listened to it 3 times already. And Maria, you were incredible. You were absolutely incredible." Maria felt tears spring to her eyes because she did not know that any recordings of her performances still existed. She had assumed that everything from her old life had been lost or destroyed, and the idea that a piece of her past was still out there, still accessible, still able to be heard, was almost too much to bear. David asked if he could come see her, if they could meet somewhere and talk more about her story, and Maria hesitated because she was not sure she was ready for this, not sure she was ready to open up even more than she already had. But then she thought about the hope that was growing inside her, and she said yes. They agreed to meet at a small coffee shop near Maria's apartment, and she spent an hour getting ready, changing her clothes 3 times before settling on a simple blue dress that her daughter had given her for her birthday, and brushing her gray hair until it shone. When she arrived at the coffee shop, David was already there, sitting at a table by the window with a laptop open in front of him, and when he saw her, he stood up and smiled, and it was a real smile, not the cold and dismissive expression she had seen on his face so many times before. He pulled out a chair for her and asked what she wanted to drink, and he treated her with a respect and a courtesy that she was not used to receiving from the young students at the conservatory, and she felt tears threatening to fall again, because kindness was something she had learned to live without. David turned his laptop around so she could see the screen, and there was a video loaded, a grainy black and white recording that showed a young girl in a white dress sitting at a grand piano on a stage, and Maria gasped because she was looking at herself, looking at the 16-year-old girl she had once been, looking at a ghost from a past she had tried so hard to forget. "Can I play it?" David asked, and Maria nodded because she did not trust herself to speak, and he pressed a button, and suddenly the coffee shop was filled with music, with the sound of Chopin being played by a young Cuban prodigy who had no idea that her life was about to be turned upside down. Maria watched herself play, watched her young fingers dance across the keys, watched her young face shine with joy and passion and love for the music, and the tears finally came, streaming down her cheeks as she mourned the life she had lost, the career she had never had, the future that had been stolen from her. David reached across the table and took her hand, and he did not say anything because there was nothing to say. He just held her hand and let her cry, let her grieve for the girl in the white dress who had deserved so much more than life had given her. When the recording ended, Maria wiped her eyes with a napkin and took a deep breath, and she looked at David and saw that he was crying too, this young man who had once seemed so arrogant and so cold, and she realized that what had happened in the recital hall had changed him just as much as it had changed her. "I want to help you," David said, and his voice was thick with emotion. I want the world to know your story. I want people to hear you play. I want to give you back what was taken from you, please. Will you let me help you?" Maria did not know what to say because this was all happening so fast, because yesterday she had been invisible, and today this young man was offering to change her life. And she was afraid of hopping too much, afraid of being disappointed, afraid of stepping out of the shadows she had been hiding in for so long. But then she thought about her father, about Roberto Gonzalez, who had believed in her from the moment she was born, who had taught her everything she knew, who had died with an apology on his lips because he thought he had failed her, and she knew what he would want her to do. "Yes," she said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Yes, I will let you help me. I am tired of being invisible. I am tired of hiding. I am tired of living like I have nothing to offer the world. Yes, David, please help me." David smiled and squeezed her hand, and he told her that he had already talked to his friends from the night before, and they all wanted to help too, and he had a plan that might seem crazy but just might work if Maria was brave enough to try it. He explained that he wanted to record her telling her story, just like she had told it to them in the recital hall, and he wanted to post the video online where people all over the world could see it, and he believed that once people heard what she had been through and what she could do, they would want to help too. Maria felt fear grip her heart because the idea of millions of strangers watching her and listening to her story was terrifying. But she also felt something else, a spark of the old fire that had burned inside her when she was young, the fire that had driven her to practice for hours every day, the fire that had made her a champion. "Let us do it," she said, and she was surprised by how strong her voice sounded, how confident, how sure. "Let us show the world who Maria Elena Gonzalez really is." 3 days later, Maria found herself sitting in the recital hall of Hartwell Conservatory, but this time she was not there to clean. This time she was there to tell her story to the whole world, and her hands were shaking so badly that she had to sit on them to keep them still. David had arranged everything with careful attention to detail, borrowing professional camera equipment from the conservatory's media department, setting up lights around the stage, recruiting his friends to help with the sound and the editing. And Maria was amazed by how much effort these young people were putting into her story. Sarah had done her makeup, using gentle colors that made Maria's weathered face look softer and warmer, and Jennifer had helped her pick out an outfit, a simple black blouse and gray pants that were elegant without being too formal, and even Michael and Tom had contributed by spreading the word to other students who had come to watch and support. The recital hall was not empty this time, but filled with about 50 students and a few professors who had heard rumors about what had happened that night and who wanted to see for themselves if the stories were true, if the old cleaning lady could really play like a master. Maria looked out at all those faces looking back at her, and she felt her courage wavering, felt the urge to run away and hide like she had been hiding for so many years. But then she saw David give her a thumbs up from behind the camera, and she took a deep breath and began to speak. She told her story from the beginning, just as she had told it to the students 3 nights ago, starting with her childhood in Havana, with her father teaching her to play, with the years of practice and dedication that had turned her into a prodigy who won the national competition at just 16 years old. Her voice trembled at first, but as she spoke, she felt herself growing stronger, felt the words coming more easily, felt the story taking on a life of its own as it poured out of her after decades of being locked away in silence. She told them about the night her family fled Cuba, about the terrifying journey across the ocean in a small fishing boat, about arriving in America with nothing but the clothes on their backs, about the years of struggle and sacrifice that followed as they tried to build a new life from nothing. She told them about watching her father's spirit break as he went from being a respected music teacher to washing dishes in a restaurant kitchen, about her mother working her fingers to the bone as a seamstress just to put food on the table, about her own dreams fading away as survival became more important than anything else. And she told them about the conservatory, about getting a job as a cleaning lady 15 years ago, about walking through these hallways night after night listening to students play, about standing in the darkness of this very recital hall and looking at the piano she was too afraid to touch. When she finished speaking, there were tears on many faces in the audience, and Maria realized that her story had touched something universal, something that went beyond music and nationality and age, something that spoke to the pain of loss and the power of dreams that refused to die. David asked if she would play for them, just as she had played that night when he first discovered her, and Maria nodded and walked to the piano with legs that felt like they were made of water, and she sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys. This time, there was no fear, no hesitation, no voice in her head telling her she did not belong there, because Maria had finally realized something important, something that had been true all along but that she had been too blind and too scared to see. She belonged at this piano, she had always belonged at this piano, because music was not something she did, it was something she was, and no amount of tragedy or hardship or years of silence could ever take that away from her. She began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1, and the notes filled the recital hall like light filling a dark room, and the audience sat in stunned silence as this 68-year-old woman in her simple black blouse delivered a performance that would have been remarkable from anyone, but was nothing short of miraculous from someone who had not played professionally in over 50 years. When she finished, the applause was deafening, every person in the hall on their feet, cheering and crying and clapping so hard their hands hurt, and Maria sat at the piano with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by a flood of emotions she could not even begin to name. David stopped the recording and rushed to the stage to hug her, and soon all the students were crowding around her, congratulating her, thanking her for sharing her story, telling her she was an inspiration and a hero and a living legend. That night, David spent hours editing the video, cutting together the interview and the performance into a 10-minute piece that told Maria's story with power and beauty, and when he was finished, he uploaded it to the internet with a simple title, "The Cleaning Lady Who Played Like a Master." He shared the link on social media and sent it to a few friends, expecting that maybe a few hundred people might watch it over the next few weeks, expecting that it might make a small ripple in the vast ocean of content that flooded the internet every day. But what happened next was beyond anything David or Maria or anyone else could have imagined, because the video did not make a small ripple. It made a tidal wave that swept across the internet and captured the hearts of millions of people all over the world. Within 24 hours, the video had been viewed over 100,000 times, and within 48 hours, it had crossed 1 million, and within a week, it had been seen by over 5 million people in countries all over the globe, from America to China, from Brazil to Russia, from Australia to South Africa. Comments poured in by the thousands, people sharing their own stories of dreams lost and found, people crying at their computers and phones, people tagging their friends and family and saying, "You have to watch this, you have to see this. This is the most beautiful and inspiring thing I have ever seen." News organizations started calling the conservatory, asking for interviews with Maria and David, wanting to know more about this incredible story that had captured the imagination of the world. And suddenly, Maria's phone was ringing constantly with calls from reporters and producers and journalists. She did not know how to handle all the attention, did not know what to say or how to act, and she felt overwhelmed and scared and exhilarated all at the same time, like she was standing on the edge of a cliff looking down at a beautiful but terrifying new world. Her daughter Rosa called her crying, saying she had seen the video and could not stop watching it, saying she was so proud of her mother, so proud of everything she had overcome, so proud that the whole world was finally seeing what Rosa had always known, that Maria Elena Gonzalez was an extraordinary woman, And Maria sat in her small apartment surrounded by the ringing of her phone and the buzzing of her computer. And she thought about the girl in the white dress who had won the national competition all those years ago. And she realized that maybe, just maybe, that girl had not died after all. Maybe she had just been sleeping, waiting for the right moment to wake up and take back the life that had been stolen from her. The weeks that followed were the most overwhelming and confusing and wonderful weeks of Maria's entire life, as the world responded to her story with an outpouring of love and support that she never could have imagined in her wildest dreams. Reporters came to her small apartment with cameras and microphones, asking her to tell her story again and again, and she sat on her old couch surrounded by strangers who wanted to know every detail of her life, from her childhood in Cuba to the night she was discovered playing in the recital hall. Television news programs featured her story, showing clips of her performance and interviews with David and the other students who had witnessed that magical night. And suddenly, Maria's face was appearing on screens in living rooms all over the country, her name being spoken by news anchors who called her an inspiration and a miracle. Famous musicians reached out to her, sending messages of admiration and support, telling her that her story had moved them to tears, telling her that her playing was extraordinary, telling her that she deserved to be recognized for the gift she had been given and the talent she had preserved through all those years of silence. A renowned pianist named Victor Hernandez, who had been born in Cuba just like Maria and who had become one of the most celebrated performers in the world, called her personally to tell her that he remembered hearing about her when he was a young student, that her name had been legend among Cuban musicians, that everyone had wondered what had happened to the girl who won the national competition in 1973. Victor told Maria that he wanted to help her in any way he could, and he offered to introduce her to people in the music world who could open doors that had been closed to her for so long. And Maria listened in disbelief, as this man she had admired from afar suddenly became her friend and ally. The Hartwell Conservatory did not know what to do with all the attention, and the administration scrambled to respond to the sudden fame of their cleaning lady. And eventually, the president of the conservatory himself invited Maria to his office to discuss her future. He was a tall man with gray hair and kind eyes named Dr. Thomas Mitchell, and he sat across from Maria in his fancy office with its leather chairs and wooden bookshelves. And he told her that he had watched her video and that he had been deeply moved by her story. He offered her a full scholarship to study at the conservatory, saying that it was never too late to pursue an education in music, but Maria politely declined because she knew that she did not need to learn how to play. She needed to remember, and the memories were coming back to her stronger every day. But there was something else Dr. Mitchell could offer her, something that made Maria's heart leap with joy and disbelief, and he told her that the conservatory's annual winter gala was coming up in just 1 month, a prestigious event that attracted donors and dignitaries from all over the region, and he wanted Maria to be the featured performer. Maria stared at him in shock, unable to believe what she was hearing, because this was the same stage where world-famous musicians had performed, the same stage where students dreamed of playing one day, the same stage where she had crept in the darkness like a thief just to look at the piano she loved. She wanted to say yes immediately, but fear gripped her heart because performing at a gala was very different from playing alone in an empty hall, and the idea of sitting in front of hundreds of wealthy and important people made her feel like she might faint right there in Dr. Mitchell's office. She asked for time to think about it, and Dr. Mitchell smiled and said, "Of course, take all the time you need." And Maria left his office with her head spinning and her heart pounding, and her mind filled with a confusion of hope and terror. That night she called her daughter Rosa and told her about the offer, and Rosa screamed so loud that Maria had to hold the phone away from her ear. And Rosa said of course she had to do it. Of course she had to say yes. This was the chance of a lifetime. This was everything she had ever deserved. But Maria was still afraid of failing, afraid of disappointing all the people who believed in her, afraid of proving that she was just an old woman who had gotten lucky once and could never do it again. She went to the conservatory the next day and found David practicing in one of the small rooms on the second floor, and she knocked on the door and asked if she could talk to him, and he stopped playing immediately and gave her his full attention. She told him about the offer from Dr. Mitchell, about the gala, about the chance to perform on the biggest stage she had ever been offered, and then she told him about her fears, about the voice in her head that said she was too old and too out of practice and too broken to ever be great again. David listened without interrupting, and when she was finished, he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said something that Maria would never forget as long as she lived. "Fear is just a story we tell ourselves," he said, and his voice was calm and sure. "It is not real, it is not true, it is just a story, and you can choose to believe it or you can choose to write a new story, a story where you are brave and strong and capable of anything." He told her that he had been afraid too, afraid of what people would think when he shared her video, afraid of how his friends and professors would react, afraid of stepping out of his comfort zone and doing something that mattered, but he had done it anyway because some things are more important than fear. And Maria looked at this young man who had once seemed so arrogant and so cold, who had once walked past her without seeing her, who had once laughed when he saw her sitting at the piano, and she realized that he had changed, that knowing her story had changed him, that maybe, just maybe, she had helped him become a better person. She made her decision right there in that small practice room, and she thanked David for his wisdom and his friendship, and she walked straight to Dr. Mitchell's office and told him that yes, she would perform at the Winter Gala. She would face her fears and stand on that stage and play her heart out for anyone who wanted to listen. The weeks that followed were filled with practice and preparation, with Maria spending hours every day at the conservatory, no longer as a cleaning lady, but as a respected guest who had been given unlimited access to the recital hall and the beautiful Steinway piano she loved so much. She practiced Chopin's Ballade No. 1 until she could play it in her sleep, until every note was perfect, until her fingers remembered every phrase and every chord without her mind having to think about it, until the music flowed through her like blood through her veins. And as the day of the gala approached, Maria felt the fear slowly being replaced by something else, something stronger and more powerful, something that had been sleeping inside her for 52 years and was finally ready to wake up and show the world what it could do. The night of the Winter Gala arrived with a cold wind blowing through the city and snowflakes falling from the dark sky like tiny white stars, and Maria stood in a small dressing room behind the stage of the recital hall, looking at herself in the mirror and trying to remember how to breathe. She was wearing a beautiful black dress that her daughter Rosa had helped her pick out, simple and elegant with long sleeves and a flowing skirt that made her feel like the young girl she had once been, and her gray hair was styled in soft waves around her face, and she was wearing just a touch of makeup that made her eyes look bright and alive. Rosa was there with her, holding her hand and telling her how beautiful she looked, how proud she was, how this was going to be the greatest night of both their lives, and Maria squeezed her daughter's hand and tried to absorb some of her confidence and calm. Through the walls, Maria could hear the sound of hundreds of people taking their seats in the recital hall, the murmur of conversations, and the rustling of expensive clothes and the clinking of champagne glasses, and her heart beat faster with every passing minute. David knocked on the door and poked his head in, telling Maria that it was almost time, that the hall was full, that there were cameras from 3 television networks ready to broadcast her performance to the whole world, and Maria felt like she might faint right there on the floor. But then she closed her eyes and took a deep breath, and she thought about her father Roberto, about how he had believed in her from the very beginning, about how he had given her the gift of music and had died believing that he had failed her, and she felt a sudden surge of strength flow through her body. She was not just playing for herself tonight. She was playing for her father, for her mother Elena, who had made her white dress all those years ago, for everyone who had ever loved her and believed in her, for everyone who had ever been told that their dreams were impossible. The stage manager came to get her, and Maria walked through the dark hallways behind the stage, her heels clicking on the floor, her heart pounding in her chest. And when she reached the wings of the stage, she could see the bright lights shining on the Steinway piano that waited for her at the center. She heard Dr. Mitchell's voice announcing her name, telling the audience about her incredible story, about the journey from child prodigy in Cuba to cleaning lady in America and back again. And she heard the applause begin, warm and welcoming and full of anticipation. And then she was walking onto the stage, walking into the bright lights that blinded her at first so that she could not see the faces of the audience, walking toward the piano that had haunted her dreams for 15 years and was now waiting for her like an old friend. She sat down on the bench and adjusted her dress. And she placed her hands in her lap and looked out at the audience. And as her eyes adjusted to the light, she began to make out the faces, hundreds of faces looking at her with expectation and curiosity and hope. She saw Rosa in the front row, crying already before Maria had even played a single note. And she saw David sitting right next to her daughter, his face shining with pride. And she saw Sarah and Michael and Jennifer and Tom, all of them there to support her on this incredible night. She saw Dr. Mitchell and the professors from the conservatory. She saw wealthy donors in their expensive suits and gowns. She saw cameras pointed at her from every angle. She saw reporters and journalists with notepads ready to capture every moment. And in the very back of the hall, standing against the wall in her faded blue uniform, she saw another cleaning lady watching with wide eyes, a young woman who probably had her own dreams and her own secrets. And Maria silently promised that she would never let anyone become invisible the way she had been invisible. She turned to face the piano and placed her hands on the keys, and the hall fell completely silent, 500 people holding their breath, waiting to hear what this 68-year-old woman with the weathered hands and the incredible story would do. Maria closed her eyes and thought about her father one last time, thought about the little girl who had climbed onto the piano bench at age 3, thought about the teenager who had won the national competition in her white dress, thought about all the years of silence and longing and hope. And then she began to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1. And the music that flowed from her fingers was the most beautiful sound anyone in that hall had ever heard, a sound that seemed to contain all the pain and all the joy and all the love that a human heart could possibly hold. Her fingers moved across the keys with the grace of a dancer, the precision of a surgeon, the passion of a lover, and the notes rose up into the air and filled the recital hall with something that was more than music, something that was magic, something that was life itself. She played through the gentle opening, through the building tension of the middle section, through the thundering crescendo that shook the hall, and she poured everything she had into every single note, every single phrase, every single moment. Tears streamed down the faces of the audience as they listened, moved beyond words by what they were witnessing, understanding that they were in the presence of something extraordinary, something that came along once in a generation, something that would be remembered forever. And when Maria struck the final chord and let it ring out into the silence, there was a moment of complete stillness, a moment when nobody moved and nobody breathed, a moment when time itself seemed to stop. Then the audience erupted in the loudest, most passionate applause Maria had ever heard, louder even than the standing ovation she had received in Cuba 52 years ago. 500 people on their feet, cheering and crying and clapping with all their strength. Rosa was sobbing openly, her face wet with tears of pride and love and joy, and David was cheering louder than anyone, pumping his fist in the air, knowing that he had been part of something miraculous, something that had changed his life just as much as it had changed Maria's. Maria sat at the piano with tears streaming down her own face, overwhelmed by the love and appreciation that was washing over her like a warm wave, feeling like her heart might burst with the fullness of this moment, this perfect and beautiful moment. She stood up and took a bow, and the applause grew even louder, and she bowed again and again, and the audience would not stop cheering, would not let her leave the stage, would not let this moment end. And as she stood there in the bright lights, bathed in the love of strangers and friends and family, Maria Elena Gonzalez finally understood something that had taken her 68 years to learn, something that her father had tried to teach her all those years ago. Music does not care about age or status or circumstance. Music does not care about tragedy or loss or decades of silence. Music only cares about the soul that plays it, and Maria's soul had never stopped playing, had never stopped singing, had never stopped dreaming, even during all those years when her fingers had forgotten how. She had been invisible for so long, just a cleaning lady pushing her cart through the hallways, just an old woman in a faded blue uniform, just another face that nobody noticed or remembered. But tonight, she was finally seen, finally heard, finally recognized for who she had always been. And as she walked off the stage to the sound of thunderous applause, Maria knew that her father was watching from somewhere beyond this world, crying tears of joy and pride, finally at peace knowing that his daughter had reclaimed her destiny. The students had laughed when they heard that a 68-year-old cleaning lady was playing the piano, but they were not laughing anymore, because Maria Elena Gonzalez had taught them all a lesson that no conservatory could ever teach, a lesson about perseverance and hope, and the incredible power of a dream that refuses to die.